So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Adam Odesser. I am director of the Dr. Stuart Lesson's Israel Action Center at the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for the third webinar in our Swords of Iron Wartime Conversations webinar series. And I'd also like to thank Charlotte Barrios, our Israel Action Center program associate, for helping to put together this important program. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital, representing more than 100 institutions throughout our region. A key component of our work is empowering, training, and mobilizing our community to engage with and advocate for Israel, and this continues to be especially critical during the current moment we are in. Today, we are 172 days since the beginning of the war between Israel and Hamas, while there are still 134 hostages being held in Gaza. On our first two webinars in this series, we hosted Haaretz journalist and former DC correspondent Amir Tibon and security expert Sarit Zehavi. And if you missed either of those, feel free to visit our Israel at War resource page, where you can not only find those recordings, but also other information regarding our current work and upcoming events and programs. This week alone, we have seen several political developments taking place in Israel, including discussions over the very controversial Haredi or ultra-Orthodox draft bill, the departure of a political party from the emergency government, and of course, increased tensions between the Israeli government and the US administration following the passing of a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire that the administration decided to not veto. To discuss these developments and also provide an overview on the impact of the war on Israeli politics and Israeli society since the beginning of the war, we are happy to be joined today by Lahav Harkov. Lahav is the senior political correspondent for Jewish Insider, covering Israel's domestic and international politics. She was previously a senior contributing editor, a diplomatic reporter, and Knesset reporter for the Jerusalem Post. Lahav was also recognized for her social media reporting by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which named her the 5th most influential person on Jewish Twitter. Before I pass it over to Lahav, a couple of housekeeping items. Lahav will speak for about 30 minutes, and I will then follow up with a question or two that we've received in advance. And for the remaining time, we will be taking questions that come in through the Q&A, which you can be found at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to note that this call is being recorded and will be shared once the program is done, and closed captioning is available as well. So with that, I want to pass it over to you, Lahav. Again, thank you for being here, and the screen is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk, as Adam said, about sort of domestic Israeli political issues. So I'm going to be touching on different elements of the war, the US-Israel relationship, but through that prism of domestic politics. But in the Q&A, feel free to ask me anything about the war, and if I can answer, if I know the answer, I will answer it. But let's start by talking about October 6th, or even before October 6th, on Yom Kippur of 2023. As Israel was heading into Yom Kippur in 2023, there was a huge political debate going on that was really tearing the country apart about judicial activism in Israel. I'm not going to get into what exactly judicial activism means, why people were for it, as some people were for it and some people were against it, but in very broad strokes, it divided the country between right and left, and most of the religious people went on the right side of this debate, and most of the secular, well, a large quantity of the secular people went on the left side of the debate. And there were mass protests around the country against this government policy to try to curb judicial activism. They were going on every night, every Saturday night. They had actually started before the government officially proposed this judicial reform, because at first they were against Netanyahu's, the corruption allegations against Netanyahu, but they grew much more when the judicial reform came out. And politicians on the center and left of the country were convincingly making the argument that the government, the right-wing coalition's policies, were going to undermine democracy. I say convincingly in the sense that the protests grew exponentially larger. I'm not saying you have to be convinced or that I'm convinced, yes or no, but they managed to convince a large number of people. This somewhat esoteric and like wonky political issue became just the big fault line in Israeli society that also sort of emphasized all these other fault lines, like I said, right and left, secular and religious. Those were the main ones. Maybe some will say Mizrahi Ashkenazi, but I don't think that that divided as neatly as those other ones. And as we went into Yom Kippur, some of the people protesting, also some people on the sort of right/religious side felt that some of the protests had become explicitly anti-religious and not just anti this judicial reform. And there was going to be an annual prayer service held. There was for the 3 years, like since COVID, there had been a Yom Kippur prayer service held in Dizengoff Square, which is in the center of Tel Aviv. And they wanted to hold it again that year. And the Tel Aviv municipality basically said that they can't hold it with men and women in separate sections. They can't have the divider the way you do in Orthodox prayer, which in Israel, the vast majority of prayer services are Orthodox. The numbers of conservative, reform, or other egalitarian prayer services is minuscule. So they were planning to have gender separated standing. The Tel Aviv municipality said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. The legality of that, let's say, is one of the many debates that have to do with judicial activism and judicial reform. And they held the prayer service anyway with a sort of informal gender separation. They didn't have like some sort of big mechitza, but they did have, I think it was flags. They had Israeli flags up. And anti-judicial reform / anti-religious protesters came and disrupted the Yom Kippur prayer. And this was like this huge, almost like traumatic moment for many, many Israelis, where this political argument came to a point where you couldn't hold a Yom Kippur prayer in the public square for one side, and then people, on the other side were saying, well, they want to force gender separation into the public square. It just became this like really ugly moment in a day that was supposed to be about forgiveness, a solemn day, a day in which the vast majority of Israelis fast, even if they're not religious. And the country was, and it's just sort of emblematic of this like sort of divisiveness and ugliness that was sort of stewing in Israel. Another thing that was going on in the country, by the way, is that there were one of the groups that was leading the protests were groups of IDF reservists who were saying that if judicial reform happens, they won't report to reserve duty. Ultimately, we know they didn't actually do that, but that was also sort of part of the ugliness of the debate, or the depth of the debate, the passionate of the debate, that people who had given many years to doing reserve duty felt so strongly about this that they said they weren't going to do it anymore. And then people on the right said, well, this is the national security of the country. How could you threaten something like that? That's where we were on October 6th, right? This really, really deep divisions, really ugliness. October 7th happened, and the country really, really came together. I mean, even you talk about these groups that were threatening not to do reserve duty. First of all, there was no like significant numbers of people refusing to do reserve duty. If anything, there were people who were too old for reserve duty volunteering to come back. You had Israelis living in other countries who were flying, and you had planefuls of like Israeli Americans in their 20s coming back to do their reserve duty. But also people who aren't reservists, right? They all sort of came together. Volunteerism happening across the country, people saying, okay, now's not the time for politics, now's not the time for those divisions. And that held for some time. That actually really, I think, held pretty well for a few months. I mean, if you're very online and you're on Twitter all the time, you could say, no, nobody was ever united. But if you're in the real world and not only living on Twitter, you see actually for months, people were very, very united and focused on the war effort. And politics was mostly on the back burner. The domestic politics of Israel, it was only about the war. It was only about passing things that had to do with the war, whether it was, making sure small business owners who were on doing the reserve duty got some sort of grant so they could keep their businesses open. I know I wrote about for Jewish Insider, the Knesset, like judicial committee was discussing whether there should be some sort of special tribunal to try the terrorists from October 7th, as opposed to going through the regular court system that could take a very long time. They were looking at the example of the Nuremberg trials or Guantanamo, things like that. So it was like the Knesset was functioning, but it was very, very focused on the war. And I think this was the case for a really long time. And the only sort of movement in domestic politics was there going to be an emergency government or what's called a unity coalition, yes or no? Within a few weeks, Benny Gantz, who was one of the major opposition politicians, not the opposition leader, but a major politician in the opposition, joined the coalition, which was now being called the emergency government or the emergency coalition, became a member of the war cabinet, the 3-member war cabinet, which was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and then Benny Gantz, who himself is a former defense minister and a former IDF chief of staff. And that held for a while. Now, it's not to say there were no political debates, and I think that there were pretty strong political debates around the issue of the hostages. That was where you started to hear dribs and drabs about it. Specifically, you would hear accusations that the government wasn't doing enough to get the hostages out. This started, I would say, the first hostage deal where 110 hostages came out, it ended on December 1st. That was when Hamas broke the ceasefire and said they weren't releasing any more hostages. So pretty soon after that, I would say, I don't have like an exact date I could give you, is a time when you started to feel like this became a political hot topic. And it was happening among the hostage families, which is also something, if you could go back and read in Jewish Insider, I wrote a few things about the hostage families. There's a small group of hostage families that you could say they're sort of more hawkish, and they oppose releasing Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the hostages. That's their own children, right? And many of them, some of them now know that their children are no longer living, but I think at the time, none of them knew whether their children are living or not. And some of them still don't know. They don't have any signs of life, or some of them might have some signs of life. Either way, the big forum that you hear about in the US, that the Bring Them Home Now, they were the people leading that forum. There's a variety of political views among the families, and we're talking about hundreds of people, right? These family members. But the position that the forum was putting forward was one about do anything, do whatever you can. Ronen Tzur was one of those popular or successful, I would say, political strategists in Israel, was basically leading the forum, and he was going on the media on Israeli TV, Israeli news chat programs all the time, and saying that you should just empty the prisons, release all the Palestinian terrorists. I mean, we're talking about, some of them are arrested for, I don't know, a Facebook post that says kill the Jews, but we're talking about many people with blood on their hands, and Israelis know that. He was going on TV and saying, empty the prisoners, empty Israel's prisons, let them all out just to get our relatives home. And you could see that there was sort of a strain there, because then you would have another hostage parent come on and say, no, actually, I don't want these terrorists to be released in the streets to kill other people for my son. That was where I think you started to see the cracks, right? And you started to hear accusations, and then opposition politicians started to join in and say, oh, does this government really care about the hostages? Do they want to release the hostages? Along with that came a decision from the Supreme Court that said the government needs to pass some sort of policy relating to Haredi or ultra-Orthodox conscription into the IDF. Now, this has been an intractable political problem for 25 years. And I'm not going to get into the whole history, but in 1999 was the first time that the Supreme Court said that a law has to be passed. I'm not sure. There might have been something else in the past, but in 1999 was a major Supreme Court decision saying that some kind of law has to be passed where you can't just have a blanket exception for all Haredim to go into the IDF. Within a few years, the Knesset passed something called the Tal Law, which said basically if you're a full-time yeshiva student, you don't have to go into the army. So the situation stayed exactly the same. They just passed a law that I guess was acceptable to the Supreme Court until 10 years later, when the court once again ruled that the government has to do something. Basically, since 2012, this has been on the political agenda. Laws were passed, then laws were sort of softened to the point of irrelevance, and then the Supreme Court ruled again. The collapse of the government in 2018, which led to the 2019 election, and then remember we had 5 elections in 4 years. That was in part triggered because the Supreme Court, a deadline was approaching where the Knesset had to pass some kind of law on the Supreme Court's orders to address it, and they couldn't agree in the coalition. So once again, the Supreme Court said, listen, you've postponed this enough times because you had all of these elections in all of these years, but that's it. Like, this government now has lasted more than a year. Time's up. You need to pass a law. The deadline is actually the deadline for the government to give some sort of response to the Supreme Court that it's doing something is tomorrow, just so you know. But they said this in February. And a few days later, the Defense Ministry or the IDF came to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and said, we need to change some of our plans when it comes to like our human resources of the IDF. In Israel, they still translate it to manpower. I know that's not politically correct in America anymore, but they still call it manpower. Anyway, they said that there was a plan to reduce the length of service for young men from 3 years to, I think it was about 4 months less. And they said, we're going to cancel that. And reservists in Israel, you end your reserve duty when you turn 40, unless you have 6 children before you're 40. But for most reservists, they just end when they're 40. And they said, we're going to have to extend that as well. And also the reservists are going to have to do more days of reserve duty per year. Suddenly you had people in the Knesset for sure, but also in the public saying, hold up, there are tens of thousands of able-bodied young men who are not serving in the IDF every year. Why do the people who are already serving have to serve even more? And, you know, this is happening just as the Supreme Court said that the situation where there's basically a blanket exemption for Haredim when they turn 18 is not legal, is not constitutional. So we are now in this like crunch time where there's a deadline. Tomorrow is the deadline for the government to give a response to the Supreme Court. Okay, they can ask the Supreme Court, maybe they'll get another extension, maybe they won't. The real crunch time, though, is that they have to make some kind of decision by the end of the month, which again is also only in a few days, because that's when the current law expires. And then they would have to send letters to young Haredi men saying that, you know, you need to show up to the army. If that happens, the 2 Haredi parties in the current governing coalition, United Torah Judaism and Shas, would leave the coalition. They would quit. I mean, this is like their #1 political issue. What's interesting is that in February, early March, you heard some voices in Shas more than United Torah Judaism. Their constituents are more likely to have served in the army, and many of their Knesset members actually also served in the army. They were saying things like we should start coming up with plans to have more Haredi only units and more options for Haredim to be able to serve in the IDF, but still continue their strictly Orthodox lifestyle. All kinds of discussions going on and saying these things in public. So this is like behind the scene whispers. But then the Sephardic chief rabbi, Yitzhak Yosef, whose father, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, was also chief rabbi of Israel. And then after that, he was the founder of the Shas party. He came out and he said, we would rather leave the country and not live in Israel anymore than have to serve in the army. And basically, once you have the spiritual leader of the party say something like that, that puts an end to all compromise, which is interesting because you really saw in their public statements that the leading figures in the Shas party or the leading politicians in the Shas party were sort of leaning towards compromise, and again, their constituents are less extreme on this issue. But now we're in a situation where they basically have taken the most extreme position. The United Torah Judaism, which is the Ashkenazi Haredi party, they always took sort of a very extreme position on this. And then on the other side of Netanyahu's coalition, you have the centrist National Union Party, which is Benny Gantz's party that joined the coalition because of the war. And they say basically we can't stay if there's still a blanket exemption for Haredim. Now you look at you look at a poll that came out earlier this month, and it's something like 90% of the people who voted for Gantz want the Haredim to enlist in the IDF. And Likud, Netanyahu's party, it's like around 2/3. Now, there's two other parties in the coalition that I didn't mention, which are the far right parties. There's the religious Zionist party, and then even further to the left is Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power. These are the parties led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. You've probably read about them. I don't need to get into their histories, but they're like the right-wing lightning rods of the coalition, let's put it that way. And their voters also are, around half, I would say, of their voters think that the Haredim should enlist in should be conscripted into the IDF. You look at the religious Zionist party, you look at the religious Zionist sector of society in Israel, which is similar in size to Haredim. It's a bit smaller than the Haredim, but similar. And they're the men all basically serve in the IDF. Smotrich himself served in the IDF, although it was like a brief service because he went to law school before the army. They didn't put him for a full, but he served. And when you look at the numbers of people who died in fighting in this war in Gaza, 40% of them come from religious Zionist backgrounds, even though they're only around 10% of the population. So this is a population that is really, really committed and devoted to serving in the IDF. Clearly somewhat less committed to forcing other people to serve in the IDF, but still about 50% of their voters are in favor of conscripting Haredim. And then Ben-Gvir's party also is around, they're as hawkish as one could get politically in Israel, and so they also are pretty supportive of it. So Netanyahu is sort of in this position where he could either do the thing that will satisfy two of his Haredi coalition partners, which is his political instinct. He always wants to keep them happy because they have these sort of little specific things they need, and otherwise they're loyal partners. So he wants to keep them happy. But on the other hand, his base and the base of every single other party in the coalition basically wants something else. So he's in a very difficult political position. Now, going forward, it looks like the cabinet tomorrow morning is going to pass some sort of cabinet decision, basically extending the law that expires at the end of the week until June. And then they're going to pass a very lenient Haredi conscription law that sets targets of certain numbers. And then the funding for the yeshivas will be cut if they don't send a certain amount of students. But whether that'll actually happen or not, whether the coalition will fall apart over this remains to be seen. And it's, in a way, they're just kicking, if they pass that cabinet decision tomorrow morning, which I think is likely, although you never know in Israel, then they're sort of kicking the can down the road till the summer, where you're going to have the same sort of political deadline and crisis situation again. While all of this is going on, over 9 days ago, a minister named Gidon Sar made a political announcement. Now, Gidon Sar was one of the most prominent figures in Likud and seen by many as the heir apparent to Netanyahu when he retires. But he was in a bit of a rush and ran in the primaries against Netanyahu in 2020 and lost big time. I think he got less than 25% of the vote in a leadership primary against Netanyahu. He broke off, he formed his own party. He got into the Knesset in the 2021 election in his own party. He was justice minister in that brief government where Naftali Bennett was prime minister. But after that, when the next election was called, he was polling so badly, he knew he wouldn't get into the Knesset, and so he merged with Gantz's party. It's a lot. I just stuffed a lot into a short time. But basically, Gidon Sar was a prominent part, and he had 3 other Knesset members behind him, and they were like part of they were a third of Gantz's bloc, essentially, in the Knesset. 9 days ago, he announced that he is breaking off from Gantz's bloc because and this is something that, there had been murmurs for a few months already that he and Gantz disagreed on a lot of things politically. They weren't really talking. His third of the party and the other 2/3 of the party weren't really holding meetings together anymore. So he broke off and went independent, and he made an ultimatum, which is that either he is added to the war cabinet or he leaves the coalition. Now, his argument was that he feels that the war effort has been slowed down too much, that Israel isn't doing what it needs to be doing, and he wants to make that sort of more hawkish voice heard in the war cabinet, which he feels like it's not being heard there. 9 days later, and there were negotiations between Saar and Netanyahu, but he wasn't allowed in. And so today he quit the coalition. Now, Netanyahu still has his coalition still has 72 Knesset seats out of 120, so that's a really solid majority. And I honestly don't think this is going to do very much for anybody politically, but because it just happened yesterday and you might have heard about it, I just wanted to touch on it and for you not to think that I was ignoring it. But if you look forward, I don't know that this is going to do much. I've seen some sort of wishful thinking from there are figures in the Israeli left who are really mad at Gantz for remaining in the emergency coalition. They think he sort of overstayed. They think that Netanyahu is being too partisan, and so therefore Gantz staying there is sort of like legitimizing the partisanship. So I see some sort of wishful thinking on people who follow that line of thought that Saar leaving will put pressure on Gantz to also leave, but I'm skeptical about that. I think that, Saar leaving is going to make him sort of less relevant. And I'm not really sure why he decided to do it at this time. Like politically, I don't really see how this is going to help him. But in terms of the coalition stability, I don't think that it does very much here or there. Now, the other thing that we know happened yesterday is that the U.S. Did not veto the resolution at the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire. Now, right before the UN meeting about that resolution, Netanyahu's office released a statement saying that the Israeli delegation to Washington, which was going to be led by Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi, they were supposed to go to Washington last night already after Biden asked Netanyahu to send over a team to discuss alternatives to an IDF operation in Rafah, which I guess if you have questions about that, we can get into that, but I'll just talking about the political fallout here. Netanyahu said he's not going to send that delegation over if the Biden administration does not veto the Security Council resolution. Apparently, Dermer was under the impression that there were going to be two separate UN resolutions, one calling to release the hostages and one calling for a ceasefire, that they were going to be not connected to each other, and the ceasefire was not going to be conditional on the release of the hostages. Ultimately, there was one resolution that called for both things, but because the ceasefire was not conditional on the release of the hostages, it was just, we want this, and also we want this. Netanyahu said that's not enough, and that he felt that it's a change of the U.S. position. Also, and in addition, the resolution did not condemn Hamas, which is what previous proposals by the U.S. did. And in fact, that was why Russia and China vetoed a resolution by the U.S. the previous week. There's this sort of back and forth between Jerusalem and Washington happening in statements to the press and press conferences and things like that, where the U.S. says, no, it's not a change of policy. And Israel says, yes, it is. I think if you look black and white, like at the text that the U.S. put forward last week that was vetoed and the text that the U.S. did not veto yesterday, I mean, they just abstained from the vote. They're different. I mean, they're objectively different. Whether that warrants canceling the delegation to Washington or not is another question, which opinions vary among people. Certainly, I respect. I don't think I have a definite answer. I personally, I don't know. I'm not sure. I can make either argument, I think, pretty well. But the Biden administration is saying that Netanyahu is doing this for domestic political needs. Now, I do think that it helps Netanyahu when he says, like, I know how to stand up to international pressures and defend Israel's national security needs. I'm really not sure that this is going to do that for him. Because what did Netanyahu do here? He didn't send Ron Dermer and Tzachi Hanegbi, two people who in recent months almost never show up in the Israeli media anymore. Hanegbi did for a while in the beginning of the war, and then he made a few faux pas and has now exclusively behind the scenes. Ron Dermer, basically never in the Hebrew media. They're just like not people that the average Israeli thinks about very much. And I just think like if Netanyahu was trying to like flex political muscles like domestically, I just like don't think that this is going to do it. I just think everyone's going to forget about it in a few days. Now, on the other hand, you do have this situation where the Biden administration is making all these statements against Netanyahu. You know, you have Kamala Harris saying that you need to differentiate between the Israeli people and the leadership of Israel. But, you know, Israel is a democracy, right? Like we say that in Israel, for example, we say that about Iran, right? We say that, you know, the people of Iran are not our enemies. It's the leadership, the governments of Iran that are our enemies. But Israel is a democracy, right? Like this government was chosen by the people. Now, Netanyahu is not polling well. Israelis blame him, or many Israelis, I think, blame him for the security failures of October 7th. You know, maybe not him alone, but certainly he's polling very poorly. In most polls, he's getting less than half the Knesset seats he has now. But still, this is the legitimate elected government of Israel, whatever it is you think about its positions, political positions, right? And you have Chuck Schumer calling for the election, which not only Netanyahu condemns, but also Gantz, who really is Netanyahu's main competitor for prime minister. He's leading in all the polls. So you know, the argument that this fulfills a domestic need by him sort of standing up to Biden, you would also make the argument this is him showing Biden, no, actually, like, you know, I am independent. We are a sovereign state and we don't just follow your orders, you know, when you do, you know, hurt us, I guess, in the UN Security Council. So there's just strong argument either way. You know, I think that in general, Israel often relies on US vetoes in the Security Council. And so for the US not to veto what Israel views as a decision against Israel is always a big deal in Israel. So there's a lot going on there with the US-Israel relationship and how it's playing in Israel. I think, you know, Netanyahu's opposition, Yair Lapid, who's the opposition leader, excuse me, I need to drink a little water. You know, Yair Lapid keeps playing on this theme of Netanyahu is destroying the US-Israel relationship. Gantz is more sort of subtle about it, doesn't go that far. I do think that the US-Israel relationship is going to play a role domestically moving forward, and is already. But I do think that there is a bit of a rally. I think there is a rally around the flag effect on it because Israelis don't like being told how to vote. And, you know, they don't like external people telling them what we should be doing when we're a democratic country. And I also think that the specific issue that the Biden administration is focusing on is, you know, they seem to have the sort of political views of Israelis wrong. And the polling is pretty simple, black and white. So I don't really know, you know, that I don't know why they're getting it wrong in that way, but you know, they keep talking about two things. Number one is whether the IDF should go into Rafah or not, which again, like I'm not going to get into the military issue there, but politically in Israel, there is massive support. Depending on the polls, it's 2/3 to 3/4 of Israelis support a major IDF incursion into Rafah. And large numbers. I just yesterday saw a poll that said 2/3 of Israelis support it, even if the US opposes it, right? So that's not the issue you're going to nail Netanyahu on. The division, there's a greater division over sort of what should happen after the war, whether there should be Palestinian Authority involvement, but the majority of Israelis still are opposed to the Palestinian Authority's involvement in Gaza. Whether that's like realistic or not, I personally, from what I see, from the evidence I see, including certain like subtle ways in which the Palestinian authorities are already starting to get involved in civilian matters in Gaza, I'm not sure how realistic it is that they won't be involved, but certainly, Mahmoud Abbas was a Holocaust denier. The Palestinian Authority incentivizes terrorists by paying them in prison or paying their family members if they're killed in a terrorist in executing a terrorist attack, such that Israelis have very good reasons to be skeptical of the Palestinian Authority, and those are the reasons Netanyahu emphasizes. So I'm going to end because it's been half an hour, but basically the Biden administration is pushing Netanyahu on issues where Israelis are more likely to rally behind him rather than to feel like, this is bad for the U.S.-Israel relationship, so we better change. Now, it wouldn't make sense for the Biden administration to intervene on whether Haredim are in the IDF or not, for example. So I'm not really sure what they would do differently if they want to continue putting pressure on Netanyahu specifically. But what they're doing now in terms of Netanyahu is not working. And Netanyahu is pretty unpopular right now as it is. Like they might be helping him more than harming him by being so open about their disdain. So thank you. I'll take the questions now.
Great. Lahav, thank you. There was a lot to take in. And appreciate kind of the overview, kind of bringing us to the moment we're in right now. I'm kind of connect to kind of what you've ended with, and there was a few questions kind of on that on the same note, kind of talking about how does all this political maneuvering both internally with the ultra-Orthodox parties and the law, and the the impact of the U.S.-Israel dynamics currently, what impacts, if at all, will it have on the continuation of the war? You just said, a majority of Israelis do want, but support an operation into Rafah. And I think it's understandable because there are, Hamas has basically moved all of their units and infrastructure to there. So how do you see this, all this political maneuvering really impacting the continuation of the war? It seems like there's a hesitation in terms of the military aspect. What is Israel doing? What will Israel be doing next? But how does the the relationship, the dynamics between Israel and the U.S. and internally between the politics that that the prime minister is playing with the other parties to try and figure out how to pass this law or push the can down the road, as you mentioned.
So I think that in terms of like the domestically, right, at least within Netanyahu's coalition, and I think also beyond that, there's support for continuing this war and entering Rafah, and then Netanyahu doesn't really have a problem on that front. Now, Netanyahu says once the IDF goes into Rafah, it'll be a matter of weeks before they're finished. So I think that as long as he manages to pass his cabinet decision tomorrow, I don't think that the domestic political schedule has to conflict with the war. Like, I think that, assuming that Israel's going to go into Rafah, which, at least based on Netanyahu's public statements, you can also listen, Ron Dermer was on Dan Seiner's podcast last week, and he said, no matter what they're doing this, whether the U.S. supports or not, though they would really like to try to convince the U.S. to be on board. So I think this is going to happen. And I don't think that it has to really conflict with the domestic politics in any way, not just both in the schedule and in the support that Netanyahu is going to receive. I think that the domestic politics are really, really about other issues. Right now, it's about Haredim. There might be other things, budgetary things. There's the hostages, which I also discussed, which there have been some like really ugly scenes in the Knesset, hostage families shouting down Knesset members not being able to restrain themselves from responding to those hostage families. And that sort of ugliness is also going on. But and maybe, when we talk about the hostage negotiations and the ceasefire negotiations, those are things that I think there's a lot more domestic sort of controversy around them than the actual war itself.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I often, I talk to our community here. We talk about how for us, we're over here. At times, it seems easy for us to kind of debate, what the best options are for Israel, which there really aren't. And they're all kind of, pick your poison. And the impossible, debate of whether, what is more important, eliminating, returning all the hostages or eliminating a terrorist organization that wants to basically continue what they started on October 7th.
I
So,
think there was
yeah.
a really good column. There was a column this week by David Brooks in the New York Times that I think really encapsulated a lot of the questions and this feeling about like there's no very good options here. Like all of the options have very big downsides.
Yes, we actually have discussed that, and I
Yeah.
recommend people to go read that column. So thank you. I'm gonna try to bring in a few questions here. There was a question. One second, let me find. Oh, so it has been talked about, two main goals of returning the hostages and destroying Hamas, taking it down from its power. Is there a strategy? Do you see a strategy that Israel has in terms of trying to change the narrative internationally? Because it seems like more and more countries internationally are calling Israel to not go forward with an operation in Rafah, and doing what it can to minimize its military operations in Gaza anymore. Is there any strategy do you see from the Israeli government or just from Israel to try and combat this?
I mean, it's hard, I think, for like the average pro-Israel person watching from home to like notice everything that's going on. But Israeli diplomats around the world and Israel's foreign minister and Netanyahu himself are constantly talking to leaders around the world, and foreign ministers around the world, about these issues. Like right now, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, is in Israel. She met with Foreign Minister Katz earlier today. These things are constantly happening. And I can tell you, as someone who's covered Israeli politics and Israeli diplomacy for the past 13 years now, in times of military operations, and now this is war, full-on war, they view diplomacy as a way to give Israel sort of breathing room, like the time and space to do the things that Israel needs to do militarily. The diplomacy might have other reasons and needs and whatever at other times, but in wartime, diplomacy is about giving Israel the space to do what it needs to do. And that's constantly going on. Now, people who are not like keeping an eye on the diplomats all the time, they're seeing Israel in the media and they're saying Israel's bad at PR and Israel doesn't make its case well in TV and Israel isn't portrayed well in the media, and they're not wrong about that. Israel has had some pretty good spokespeople in this war. Alon Levy has been wonderful. He's been a friend of mine for like 10 years, long before he worked for the government. So I'll disclose that, but I think he's done a wonderful job.
He's also been pushed off from his.
Yeah, he's done with the job. Look, I think that he was sort of moving towards being done anyway. I think it was a mistake that they did it in this way so that it then brought around a bad press to the government, to the prime minister's office, because he probably would have quietly left within a short time anyway. But that's what's going on now. Mark Regev was there in the beginning as well. He was a former spokesperson for Netanyahu, very talented, and was a former ambassador to the UK. So he was also doing a lot of the media, not as much in the United States, but in Europe. And he also just left of his own volition. He needs to sort of go back to work. He's like a college professor now. He needs to go back to his real job, even though the war is still going on. But there's still efforts being made in terms of the media. I mean, and I could tell you, I hope Alon would not be unhappy with me saying this, but they're being asked a lot less to appear on TV, which is sort of part of why Mark, for example, went back to his regular job, because there was enough, it wasn't like in the first couple months of the war where there were so many media requests that they needed 3 full-time people just to handle media requests all day long. So there's that. The world's just like less interested. But it's difficult because and in this war, I'm in all these like WhatsApp groups of journalists from around the world. I'm in one group that has over 1,000 people, most of whom are journalists. And you see that even when really concrete evidence is presented, like they're automatically suspicious and trying to poke holes in everything. Now, of course, as journalists, you want to verify things, right? But there's like a level of skepticism that you see, and you see it in the articles too, right? Where like they'll be like, according to the IDF, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll say 32,000 people were killed in Gaza without saying like it comes from the Hamas health ministry, who comes up with numbers 5 minutes after a bombing, So it's just, the bias is palpable. And I can say like for myself, like I worked for the Jerusalem Post all these years, and so I was in Israeli media circles. And then I switched to Jewish Insider, which is an American publication, a month before this war. And so I'm now in the foreign media camp in terms of the things I get invited to and the WhatsApp groups that I'm in and things like that. And it's just right, you really just see the bias that these people have. Sometimes it's nauseating when it's about the sexual assault and things like that. It's nauseating, honestly. And I don't know how you fight that. Honestly, I don't, because I think that, again, they're being presented with the facts. It's not that they don't have the facts.
Yeah, I know that's also an ongoing discussion here, how to,
Yeah.
bring those stories to the forefront and support, especially the hostages and the victims of October 7th.
By the way, right before this, like within the hour before this Zoom, the New York Times published testimony from a hostage who was sexually assaulted, and I think it's incredibly courageous and so important that woman did that and came forward.
Yeah, I actually also saw that, and I'd be happy to share that article with all our viewers and listeners after the program. So again, connected to that, how are the numbers of actually, going to turn a little bit, how the numbers of Gazans that have been, said that have been killed, the tens of thousands that have been killed, how is that thought of in the Israeli public? Does that have an impact on how they think of, what the continuation or how the continuation of the war should look like?
I think there's like an awareness in Israel that it looks bad to the world. But if I'm being honest, I can't say that outside of Haaretz, which Haaretz is not like a very widely read newspaper in Israel. It's like number 6 or something in the rankings of a pretty small country. So people should understand, because it's only one of a few websites in English, like people I think that it's like a mainstream central newspaper in Israel, and it's not. It's read by people who are on the far left, and then sort of by like elite, because it's very sort of like well written and has like a better sort of cultural coverage than like other cultural, literary, those things in other papers. But it's so aside from Haaretz, I think like almost none of the media dwells on it very much, except in the sense of like, this looks bad, we're getting international pressure because of it. I think if you went up to like any Israeli on the street and said like, there are entire families of Gazan civilians who were killed, you can't, if you're a normal person, you can't help but feel for people who lost their whole family. But I think there's also a sense that we see and we hear from we see in videos from October 7th, that we hear from the hostages that a lot of quote unquote civilians took part in the terrorist attacks and in holding people hostage. And so there's also a lot of that where Israelis say, well, who is really a civilian, right? And so I know a lot of these statements made, like there are no civilians in Gaza and things like that, were then used by South Africa in their case at the ICJ, right? Um, but if there was a case being prosecuted against Hamas, which, you know, in a just world there would be, then you would also prosecute the use of so many civilians, not only as human shields, but also, you know, to hold civilians hostage and in many, many other ways. So it's like an issue that I think Israelis think it's defensible. I think that if you ask the average Israeli on the street, like they wouldn't say like, oh no, Israel's not being careful enough with civilians. I think we also hear all the time from the army that they're careful, that they do, you know, warnings and leaflets, and that they tried to move the population south. And now that Israel wants to go into Rafah, they're coming up with a plan to move the population somewhere else. They've not presented this plan yet, so I can't say I know what it is, but um, you know, those things are also part of the conversation.
Yeah. So I'll ask kind of one more question and then we will wrap up. So last question kind of, you know, we've seen the pressure that Israel has been facing internationally. We've seen now pressure from the US as well in terms of whether it's the non-vetoing decision in the UN or whether it's, you know, we've seen senators come out, whether it's Chuck Schumer or others, and the vice president saying what she had to say. And we see all these internal, you know, dynamics and pressure on this current coalition that is growing, whether it's the Haredi bill, whether it's from, you know, the Israeli public also is, you know, perhaps, I don't know, maybe you can mention, you know, reference that, talk a little bit about if there is a field of pressure on this government. You know, many are asking, can we expect this government to, you know, to collapse and there be elections in the coming months? So what are your thoughts on that? What do you think we can look forward to in the next few months?
Look, this Haredi issue is a destabilizing factor for the coalition. But Netanyahu frankly, like a political genius. He pulls rabbits out of his hat that nobody ever expects and wins election after election. Now, you know, okay, he hasn't won every time, but he surprises people very often when, you know, he's been written off many times and still won. So I'm not going to make a solid prediction, but I will say for the Haredi issue, they kind of have to come to some sort of resolution acceptable to the Supreme Court by the middle of the summer. And then after that, at the end of this year, though with a possible extension to March of next year, this government's going to have to pass another budget. And in Israel, if you don't pass a budget, there's an automatic election. There's no government shutdown like you have in the US. So that's another sort of, budgets are often like a breaking point for many coalitions, like not just this one that has all of these pressures and whatever. It's just often a sort of convenient time to call an election. So that's sort of like another milestone that I would look towards to say maybe that's when an election will be called. But we don't know for sure. There doesn't have to be an election until the end of 2026. It's hard for me to imagine Netanyahu hanging on that long, but crazier things have happened.
Yeah. Okay, so I kind of want to wrap up, and you know, if you have any thoughts, kind of what do you think the Israeli public and Israel needs, or what can the Jewish community here in the U.S. do for Israel during this time? You know, in supporting it and advocating for it. Happy to hear your thoughts.
First of all, I do think that the American Jewish community is having a hard enough time as it is, so I don't want to put more of a burden on people, right? I think I and Israelis who are in the know about these things, I think sort of respect and value the stand that many American Jews are taking in support of Israel, because I think that stand is more difficult now than it has been maybe ever, you know? And so I think there's a lot of appreciation for that. I think things that are important and can move the needle are, first of all, sort of like lobbying and political efforts to make sure that the US continues to support Israel in this war. I know, there was this UN thing, and the Biden administration has said a lot of things that don't make Israel happy, and those are significant. But the most significant thing the U.S. does is to continue to sell arms to Israel, and to continue. And by sell arms, I mean it's true. Many of it is the money paying for it is U.S. aid money, but to continue the military aid to Israel. And these are things that I guess if you live in a district where you have a representative who is wobbly on that issue, call them, send them letters, etc. I know, this is Greater Washington. I know that there are some some issues in Maryland, for example. So, that helps Israel. The other thing is for people who know how to write well, who know how to make their voice heard in various media, in newspapers, to write op-eds, who are experts in different areas and can reach out to journalists and try to, make the pro-Israel stance heard. I think that's also helpful. And finally, I think we have these communities that have been really, really devastated on October 7th. You look at the kibbutzes, that huge segments of them have been burnt down. You have reservists who left their businesses for months and months and have to figure out how to support their families now. People who have been evacuated from their home for months. Are still 55,000 Israelis evacuated from Israel's north. I mean, we didn't even talk about the north at all this whole time, and God knows what's going to happen there. And so, for those of you who are able to donate and lend support to any of those causes, I think it's really important at this time. I mean, of course, the Israeli government is doing all kinds of things, but I can say that I know, like I happen to have given a talk also to the team at Jewish Federation of Jewish Federations of North America that was allocating funds to different places in Israel. And I know that they're specifically looking to fill the gaps that the government is not paying for. So these are important and helpful things.
Thanks, Lav. And some of the things you referenced, whether it's talking about the North and talking about the communities, we've actually covered a lot of that in our previous webinars with Amir Tibon, who lives down there, and with Saeed Zavi, who lives up in the north, and talks about a little bit and give us a really brief, really expansive overview of what is happening up there. So so that's great. Kind of you referenced that and kind of bringing this all together. And in terms of what we are doing, and I want to kind of share with everyone here that this Thursday we are continuing our support for hostage families and gathering in front of the Qatar embassy here in DC to demand to press Qatar to demand from Hamas the release of the remaining hostages. And so I invite everyone on this call and everyone who will watch the recording and is watching to join us. And we also have a variety of programs happening in the next week and a half or so. So please check out our website for information on those, or feel free to reach out to us. And at this point, Lav, I want to thank you for your time and for your really expansive overview and going into the weeds of things. If you have anything else to share, otherwise I'll close it out. And to everyone, really, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and be well. Lav, thank you so much.
Thank you.